Friend, thank you for being here today. Have you ever wondered if the world is sleepwalking into a conflict far greater than the one we see on our screens? And are we truly prepared for the moment when the rhetoric of war turns into the reality of survival? We stand at a precipice today, a moment in history that future generations may look back upon as the turning point where the regional tragedy of Ukraine metastasized into a global crisis. As I sit here and analyze the latest reports coming from the front lines and the closed door meetings in Moscow, I feel a profound sense of urgency to share with you not just the news, but the deeper architecture of what is happening. We are witnessing a calculated, high stakes game of geopolitical chess where the board is being rearranged while the Western world is still debating the rules. The question we must ask ourselves is why Vladimir Putin feels emboldened enough to look directly at the collective might of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and declare, without a hint of hesitation, that if Europe wants war, Russia is ready right now. To understand this challenge, we cannot simply look at the headlines. We must look at the map, at the mud and the concrete of the battlefield, because it is there, in the cold reality of territory and logistics, that the confidence to threaten the world is born. Let us begin our analysis by looking at the ground truth, specifically at a city that has become the fulcrum of this entire strategic shift. I am speaking of Kupyansk. For months, we have watched the lines on the map fluctuate, but recent developments suggest a decisive change that alters the entire calculus of the war. This city has been given and continues to be given truly special importance by both the Ukrainian command and the Russian armed forces. Why is this specific location so critical? It is not merely a collection of buildings or a name on a map. Kupyansk is a massive infrastructure facility, a beating heart connected to an entire network of communication routes that span the region. In military language, we call this a staging ground. It is a position from which an army can project power. From this sector, it is convenient for the Russian army to move in all directions that their general staff considers the most promising. This is precisely why it was always designated by the Ukrainian side as a priority for defense and why it was a primary objective for the Russian offensive. It was a fortress, a powerful fortified area designed to hold back the tide. However, we must now confront the difficult reality that this fortress appears to have fallen. According to the latest reports from the Russian Center Grouping Commander, this city is today entirely in the hands of the Russian army. I know that doubts persist. In the fog of war, truth is often the first casualty, and for weeks there have been conflicting narratives. But we must look at the confidence with which these claims are being made. Vladimir Putin has publicly proposed that foreign journalists, including those from Western nations and even Ukraine, be granted the right to visit the city. He challenged them to see with their own eyes what is happening there and who actually controls it. When a leader invites the world's press to walk through a combat zone, it is usually because they are certain of what those cameras will find. We recall that when this offer was made a few weeks ago, the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry issued a warning, categorically opposing such visits and threatening journalists who might accept. But the harsh logic of war dictates that diplomatic protests cannot hold territory. Today, the claim is that the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry no longer has any say in the matter because the city is fully under Russian control. Of course, we must acknowledge the danger. The line of contact is very close, and drones are constantly in the air, creating a sky filled with surveillance and lethal intent. Yet, Russian military correspondents are already working there, broadcasting from the streets that were once contested. This visual confirmation serves a psychological purpose as much as a tactical one. It is designed to show the West that the narrative of Ukrainian resilience in this sector has collapsed. We have heard President Zelensky declare recently that his forces are still in Kupyansk. But we must ask, what did he mean by that? From the perspective of the Russian command, Zelensky and his leadership seem to be living on another planet, engaged in matters far removed from the blood and dirt of the combat zone. The perception being cultivated is that the Ukrainian leadership, constantly on the move and begging for financial aid, has lost touch with the current matters of the economy and, more critically, the front. To understand the depth of this advance, we have to look at the geography of the city itself. Kupyansk consists of two distinct parts. The larger, main, central part of the city lies on the right bank of the river. The smaller part sits on the left bank. The reports indicate that Russian forces now control both the entire right bank and the entire left bank. But the advance does not stop there. A little further south, along the riverbank, there is another settlement known as Kupyansk Vuzlovy. This is a substantial area. I believe there are roughly 2,000 buildings in this settlement. It is an urban labyrinth, and fighting is ongoing there as we speak. However, the data provided suggests a grim inevitability. Out of those 2,000 buildings, approximately 1,650 are already in the hands of the Russian army. There is a steady, grinding advance. The assessment is that within a few days, this settlement will also fall completely. Beyond the loss of these buildings, there is a more catastrophic tactical situation developing on the left bank of the river. We are looking at an enemy grouping numbering 15 battalions that has been blocked. In military terms, being blocked is often a prelude to destruction or surrender. The Russian forces have begun the elimination of this pocket. When we talk about 15 battalions, we are talking about a significant concentration of manpower and equipment. If these forces are encircled and eliminated, it represents a blow to the Ukrainian defensive capability that cannot be easily repaired. This battlefield success is the fuel that powers the diplomatic aggression we are now seeing. It provides the foundation for Russia to look at the West and say, we are winning and you have no leverage. This brings us to the diplomatic arena, where the failure to find a resolution is becoming as dangerous as the fighting itself. We have watched high-stakes talks take place in Moscow, meetings that were supposed to offer a glimmer of hope. President Putin met with Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and the son-in-law of United States President Donald Trump, Jared Kushner. These were 5-hour talks, marathon sessions designed to hammer out a solution to ending the war. Yet, they failed to yield a breakthrough. The Kremlin's assessment after the meeting was blunt. Peace is not closer in Ukraine. The initial American plan was broken down into 4 parts, all of which were discussed in detail. While some American proposals were deemed more or less acceptable, the talks collapsed on the most difficult issue, which is territorial disputes. Here lies the core of the deadlock. A compromise has not been found because the definitions of victory are mutually exclusive. The Russian president has demanded that Kyiv surrender territory, which Moscow claims as its own, a demand that is rooted in the reality on the ground we just analyzed. Moscow believes it has conquered these lands and has no intention of giving them back. The United States presented a new version of the plan, hammered out after the initial version raised fears in Kyiv and across Europe that it made too many concessions to Moscow. But for the Kremlin, the wording proposed did not suit them. They are operating from a position of strength, or at least a perceived position of strength, and therefore they feel no need to accept wording that implies weakness. The work will continue, they say, but the tone is one of patience, not desperation. What is most striking to me, as I analyze the geopolitical dynamics of these talks, is who was not in the room. The negotiation process is now taking place almost exclusively with the American side. We must ask, why are the Europeans silent? Or rather, why are they being silenced? The European leaders have claimed to be offended, acting as if they were excluded from the negotiations against their will. But from the Russian perspective, no one excluded them. They excluded themselves. There was a time when close contact existed, but Europe broke off those contacts. The analysis from Moscow is that Europe adopted the thesis of delivering a strategic defeat to Russia and continues to live in these illusions. They took wishful thinking for reality, believing that sanctions and isolation would bring the Russian bear to its knees. Because that did not happen, they now find themselves unable or unwilling to admit their miscalculation. By removing themselves from the process, Europe has become, in the eyes of the Kremlin, a spoiler. Seeing that the potential outcome of a Trump-brokered peace does not satisfy them, they have begun to interfere. The accusation is that Europe is hindering both the current United States administration and President Trump in achieving peace. They refused peace negotiations themselves, and now they block others. This is a profound accusation. It paints Europe not as a bastion of democracy defending a neighbor, but as a party of war that has no peace agenda. The Russian leader argues that even when Europe allegedly tries to make changes to the proposals, those changes are aimed at only one thing: to completely block the entire peace process. They put forward demands that they know are absolutely unacceptable for Russia, understanding fully that this will collapse the talks, and then they plan to shift the blame onto Russia for the failure. This narrative is essential to understand because it sets the stage for the most chilling threat we have heard in years. It allows Putin to frame a potential conflict with NATO not as a war of aggression by Russia, but as a defensive reaction against a Europe that refuses peace. This brings us to the sensational statement regarding the readiness for war. We heard recently that the European part of NATO is preparing to bring its forces to full combat readiness by the years 2029 and 2030. They are looking 5 years into the future, anticipating a risk of armed conflict. But Vladimir Putin's response to this timeline was immediate and stark. He said, "We are not going to fight Europe. I have already said this 100 times. But if Europe suddenly wants to fight us and starts, we are ready right now." I want you to pause and let the weight of that phrase sink in. Ready right now. While NATO is planning for a conflict half a decade away, assuming they have time to rearm, retrain, and rebuild their industrial base, Russia is declaring that it is mobilized today. There is no doubt in their minds. The warning goes further. The Russian president analyzed that if Europe starts a war, it will be very fast. He drew a distinction that we must pay close attention to. He said, "This is not Ukraine. In Ukraine, Russia claims to be acting in a surgical manner, moving very carefully to preserve certain structures or populations, although the devastation we see often suggests otherwise." But the implication is that a war with Europe would not be a surgical operation. It would not be a war literally in the modern sense of a slow, grinding attrition. It would be something else entirely. If Europe triggers this conflict, it could very quickly lead to a situation in which there will be no one left to negotiate with. This is a thinly veiled reference to the overwhelming destructive power that would be unleashed, a level of violence that would bypass the trenches and strike at the very existence of nations. This is why the challenge to NATO is so severe. It is a challenge based on an asymmetry of time. Europe needs time. Russia claims it does not. By stating they are ready now, they are trying to paralyze European decision making with fear. They want the populations of Berlin, Paris, and London to question whether supporting Ukraine is worth the risk of immediate annihilation. It is a psychological weapon wielded with the precision of a scalpel. But the war is not just being fought with tanks and threats of total destruction, it is being fought on the economic arteries of the world. We have seen a dangerous escalation in the maritime domain. There have been reports of attacks on tankers in neutral waters and even in the special economic zones of third states. Russia has labeled these actions as piracy, pure and simple. They argue that before the Ukrainian armed forces tried to strike at Russian seaports, Russia had responded with effective and powerful strikes concerning ships delivering military equipment. They claim to have hit exactly where they wanted, evidenced by secondary explosions from aerial reconnaissance. But now they accuse Ukraine of shifting to piracy against merchant vessels. The countermeasures being discussed are severe. First, Russia intends to expand the nomenclature of strikes on port facilities and ships that enter Ukrainian ports. But second, and more ominously, they are considering countermeasures against the ships of those countries that help Ukraine carry out these operations. This is a direct threat to the freedom of navigation and to the merchant fleets of Western nations. The most radical solution proposed by the Kremlin is to cut off Ukraine from the sea entirely. If they achieve this, if they sever Ukraine's access to the Black Sea, it effectively landlocks the country and destroys its economic viability. It would make piracy impossible in principle, they argue, but the cost would be the total economic strangulation of Ukraine. This is all growing, escalating day by day. The hope expressed by the Russian leadership is that the Ukrainian military and political elite, as well as those behind them, will consider whether this practice should continue, but it sounds less like a hope and more like an ultimatum. As we step back and look at this landscape, from the ruined streets of Kupyansk to the grand conference tables in Moscow, we are forced to confront the tragedy of this situation. We have heard from experts like Professor Peter Kuznick, a historian who views this unfolding disaster with a deep sense of sorrow. The reality is that the cards are currently in Russia's hands. Ukraine is losing ground daily on the battlefield. The loss of key territories is becoming a contentious issue that can no longer be spun nor hidden. On top of that, President Zelensky's position at home is weakening. We have seen corruption scandals taint the very officials involved in negotiations. Closest advisors and allies have been forced to resign or have fled the country. Popularity is dropping. Morale is weakening, both on the front lines and in the streets. It is a very weak position from which to negotiate the survival of a nation. Vladimir Putin's strategy is clear. If he cannot get what he wants through negotiations, he will take it on the battlefield. He intends to take the rest of the Donbass militarily. The cold logic suggests that it makes no sense for Ukraine to keep fighting if the prospect of taking back lost land is near zero. The fear, shared by many observers, is that the fighting will continue and Ukraine will simply lose more. More territory, more lives, more of its economy, and more of its infrastructure. They will be in a weaker position 3 months from now, 6 months from now, or a year from now than they are today. The longer this goes on, the worse the final settlement will be. This is the tragedy that Professor Kuznick highlights. The Europeans, whose stature has been diminished, are playing a small role, standing on the outside, trying to influence events, but no longer being major players. In some sense, they are responsible for keeping the war going by providing arms and funding without a viable diplomatic off ramp. This is a war that many believe should never have started. There were moments in 2014, 2018, and 2022 when diplomacy could have prevailed. But the West did not take Russia's demands seriously and often urged Ukraine not to negotiate, promising backing that has ultimately proved insufficient to secure victory. We have learned, or at least we should have learned, that we must resolve these disputes diplomatically and not on the battlefield. This lesson applies to the Straits of Taiwan, to the South China Sea, to the Himalayas, to Kashmir, and to Gaza. In the nuclear age, we cannot resort to war as a primary method of dispute resolution. The cost is simply too high. The lives lost on both sides, the treasure wasted, it is a sad thing for the planet to witness. So, why does Putin challenge NATO? He challenges NATO because he believes the alliance is fractured, that its timeline for readiness is too slow, and that his own forces have gained an irreversible momentum on the ground. He challenges NATO because he sees a window of opportunity where the West is tired, distracted, and divided. He is betting that when faced with the choice between a compromised peace and a catastrophic war, the West will blink. We are left with a sobering reality. The city of Kupyansk may seem far away to many of us, but its fate is tied to the stability of our entire world. If the logic of force prevails there, it sets a precedent that will echo in every contested corner of the globe. We must remain vigilant, we must remain informed, and we must understand that the rhetoric of ready right now is not just a boast, it is a warning shot across the bow of Western civilization. Friend, this brings us to the ultimate strategic dilemma, a question that is uncomfortable yet unavoidable. If the choice truly comes down to a flawed peace that cedes territory or a direct conflict between nuclear powers, which path do you believe our leaders should take? It is a question with no easy answer, but it is the question that will define our future. When we step back and view this mosaic of conflict, from the frozen trenches of the Donbass to the heated negotiation rooms in Moscow, we realize that we are no longer watching a regional dispute. We are witnessing the painful, grinding friction of tectonic plates shifting in the global order. The fall of a city like Kupyansk is not just a tactical defeat for one side. It is a signal that the era of stalemate is over. The strategy of waiting, of hoping that sanctions and time would erode Russian resolve, has collided with the hard reality of a mobilized industrial war machine that is willing to absorb costs the West finds unfathomable. The disconnect we observed earlier, where leaders speak of victory while losing ground, is perhaps the most dangerous element of all. Illusion is a luxury we can no longer afford. When political rhetoric diverges this sharply from battlefield reality, it creates a vacuum. And history tells us that such vacuums are often filled by sudden, catastrophic collapses. We must also critically examine the weaponization of time. The West operates on election cycles. Russia operates on historical cycles. When Putin says, "We are ready right now," while NATO looks toward 2030, he is exploiting the inherent sluggishness of democratic consensus. He knows that fear is a faster traveler than hope. By threatening immediate escalation, he forces European capitals to calculate the price of heating their homes and protecting their borders today, not 5 years from now. This is psychological warfare par excellence, designed to fracture the unity of the alliance before a single NATO soldier ever steps onto the field. The threat to cut off Ukraine from the sea is the final turn of the screw, a reminder that a nation without an economy cannot sustain a war, no matter how many weapons are poured into it. Furthermore, the diplomatic failure we analyzed is a tragedy of missed off-ramps. Diplomacy requires the recognition of the other side's power, however distasteful that may be. By treating the opponent as irrelevant or isolated, the West risked pushing them into a corner where their only option was to lash out with greater ferocity. Now, with the peace process deadlocked and the party of war narrative taking hold, the path back to stability is overgrown with thorns. We are drifting toward a world where might makes right, a regression to a darker century where borders are drawn in blood rather than ink. The silence of the European leaders in the negotiating room is not just a diplomatic snub, it is an abdication of responsibility in their own backyard. Ultimately, the lesson here is that indecision is a decision in itself. By delaying the hard choices, by refusing to confront the reality on the map, the global community has allowed the stakes to rise from the sovereignty of a single nation to the security of the entire continent.